of you for being here. Several of you are guests tonight, and we really appreciate your being here. Among the guests, we have some that I've known in the past. And Larry Ellis is here, and he contacted me this afternoon, and we have some ties that go way back into the 1990s, back when I was contemplating going into full-time preaching. And of course, Mike Rogers, who was just up here a few moments ago to give that wonderful prayer, his family and my family go back a long way. He said when he came in, he said, I knew you before you were, well, not quite before I was born, but he said he knew me when I was a little fellow when my dad was preaching in Bryansburg, near Benton, Kentucky. My father, his last place to preach was at Folsomdale, where your father Dennis, right, he preached there for many years. And if I'm not mistaken, Mike, didn't you preach at Clement Street? And so Clement Street is where my father's family attended for years and years. So, and then I was in graduate school with Justin, their son, who's now a professor down at Freed-Hardeman. He was much younger than I am, but I was there trying to keep up with him as well. So it's great, isn't it great when we can reunite with people? And I want to tell you, I've been bragging on Rosemark to my friends, and they say, how's the meeting going? I said, great. I said, we got some of the friendliest people at Rosemark of any place where I've met. And you're friendly. You to be committed for that. And for the Rosemark members that have been coming back, we want to commend you as well for coming and being part of this meeting. Now, last night, I told Mike and his wife when they came in, I said, I wish you'd been here last night. That was my best sermon. You know, tonight's not going to be the best sermon, but last night was on conflict resolution. And everybody wants to know the answer about how they can get somebody else to help solve a problem. And, of course, part of the solution is we need to be a part of the solution, not just look to somebody else. But for tonight, if you have your Bibles or devices, I want you to turn with me over to Proverbs chapter 24, and we're going to be there in just a moment looking at a couple of verses. Proverbs chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. Now, I've had the audience to participate a few times during this meeting to raise their hands. I'm not going to do that tonight because the question I'm going to ask right off the bat is, do you know of anybody who has a perfect family? I don't know of anybody who has a perfect family. I don't know of anybody who has a perfect spouse. They said years ago that a man was trying to preach a sermon, and he said, I don't believe there's anybody ever who's been a perfect spouse. And this one timid older man in the back raised his hand, and the preacher said, are you trying to tell me that you know of somebody who is perfect? And he said, yes, sir, preacher. He said, my wife's first husband must have been perfect because every time I do something wrong, she tells me how perfect he was. And so that's not the kind of perfection I'm looking for, but in our life, we learn as we grow. And we learn because when we go through our early stages, we really don't know what is in the future months ahead of us. We may think that we know what marriage is really about. We may think we know what true love really is. But on into our marriage, 5 years, 15 years, 50 years, we're still learning. We're still learning what it really means to have a loving and deep commitment with one another. So tonight I want us to talk about adapting to change, the family through life stages. There are various stages that we've been through. Some of us in this audience have already been through the stage of being married and then having children, watching our children as they go across that stage and graduate, watching our children as they go up and get married, and watching our children as they bring our grandchildren into the world. Our boys are 28. They're adopted at birth. We love them very dearly. They have no interest whatsoever in marrying or bringing any grandchildren. So I'm going to have to rent some or go adopt some later on if I want some grandkids. But many of you have already experienced that level. And let me tell you, being a grandparent obviously isn't the same as being a parent, because grandparents are so much more fun than parents. I remember that growing up. My grandparents were so much more fun than my parents. And so we go through these life stages. As we do these life stages, we learn, don't we? We learn how not to do things sometimes before we learn the right ways to do them. In Proverbs chapter 24, verses 3 and 4, it says, through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all the precious and pleasant riches. I wonder what kind of house you have or what kind of home you have. I hope it's a home that's been built on the truth of the Bible, that firm foundation of which we have from God. I hope that when you married your spouse that you did so and you are already both aligned with what God says that you ought to be, that you ought to be a faithful believer of God and Jesus. I hope that as you've continued in your marriage, you've instilled that into your children and told them these are the things that we expect if we're going to be a part of this family. My father was a preacher, and so I got to listen to a lot of gospel preaching, whether he was doing the preaching or somebody else. And so we went to church all the time. And even when there wasn't church worship services sometimes, but we still ended up being at the church building doing various things. Matter of fact, Mike, at the Bryansburg church, the old building, the classrooms were in the bottom. And this is BC time. That's before cable. And so I didn't have much to do in the summer times. I'd go up to be with my dad. He needed to study, so he'd send me down to the classrooms, and he'd say, just go through some stuff there and see if you can learn some things. Well, I found these sets of flashcards. You remember the flashcards where he'd talk about who was in the burning fiery furnace and things like that? And I just sat down there and I read them all and I memorized them. You know, none of the teachers ever wanted to call on me for any of the answers from then on. But anyway, you go through these stages and you've got these situations where you are building expectations for your spouse and building expectations for your children. Listen again to what the wise man said. Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. But the wisdom comes with God. These stages that we go through, sometimes as adults, we're going to find ourselves as a single person. We're unattached to anyone. We're still a family unit to ourselves as we go out on our own, and we have a lot of choices to make, don't we? And sometimes people don't always make the best choices. It's kind of like the first time that you let your children go off on a school field trip, and you know that they've got to buy a meal while they're gone, and you want them to be very careful about how they spend their money. And if they're like my kids and like I was, the first time you're independent, you don't always manage your money well. One year we went, I think, to Opryland Park when it was still a park. And so we had given the boys some money, and that was their money for the entire day. And inside of 10 minutes, one of my sons had already blown all of his money. And he didn't have any money left then to eat on or get a cold drink or anything. Well, he made a bad mistake. But those things you can overcome. And in these stages, we make some mistakes, don't we? We get into the married life. We get into married life with children. We get into married life with teenagers. And I told the story last night about what Mark Twain said about teenagers. He said, when you've got a teenager who turns 13, he said, put them in a wood barrel and nail down the lid and feed them through the knot hole. And when they turn 16, plug up the knot hole. That was what he thought about teenagers, you know. Well, listen, we survived that. I've got two. They turned teenagers the same day, and I survived that. We survived driver training with two in the house all at one time. And if you ever wanted to know how good your driving is, by the way, Tim, my driving's pretty good. I heard you in that introduction. But my two boys, when they were going through driver training school, they pointed out every single thing I did wrong all the time from the back seat. And so I was so happy for them to have a license and all their own in their own car so they couldn't critique my driving. There are three different stages I want to focus on for tonight as we think about adapting to these life changes. And the first one is the stage where we get to know our spouse. Now, this is primarily focused on husbands and wives, but we can extrapolate this out to families. But I want us to think about what it's like in that first stage. Some have called it the honeymoon or the happy honeymoon stage. And there's such jubilation that we have. There's such great things that we have that's a part of it. There's a wonderful section in Song of Solomon, chapter 2, and I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to be a part of that, but you adults, you just put that in the back of your mind and go there later and talk about that. And some of the imagery, talking about the woman talking about her husband and how he just stands out and he's just so stately and jumps like a gazelle and some other things. And then he talks about his wife in such loving terms. And when we get into that stage, what do we have? Well, we have attraction. We have not only that attraction, but we have this intensity about us as we're drawn together. I tell you, when I was dating my wife and we set a date for the marriage, all that summer before we married, we wrote letters to each other. Now, for those of you that are under the age of 25 or so, that's what you did before texting came along. And you had to actually spend money and put a stamp on the envelope and wait 2 days for it to get somewhere else. And every day, the postman without fail would bring me a letter from Carla, and I would send one to her. And so we have this intensity about our relationship together. There's also this sense that it's so ideal, that we're just made for each other. We can live on love. I don't know how many of you have ever lived on love when the money ran out, but it's not all it's cracked up to be. It sounds really good in theory until you're really there and you don't have money for gas, you don't have money for food, and there's not much in the cupboard except for, a bag of boiled rice or something like that to eat. We also have in that time indulgences where we'll just do anything for one another. And isn't it great? Somebody needs, our spouse needs something, and so we'll just indulge them. And we'll go to the nth degree to do those things. We're also infatuated during that time period. We just can't get enough time with our spouse and to be with him or with her. But when Carl and I had first married, we had a small apartment. It was really kind of in a dangerous part of Atlanta now that I think about it. But where we were happy. And we had one black and white TV. It didn't have a remote. And so we would be so happy there, and here we were, we'd be all cuddled up on the couch, and we'd watch her favorite show. And when her favorite show went off, there was another show that I didn't care much for. But she'd be asleep on me, and I loved her so much, I didn't push her off to get up to turn the TV channel. Now that changes over time. And I don't know if you realize that, but these are part of the stages that we go through in that. Let me also turn your attention to a passage in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I want us to look at verse 5. Now this is Bible. This is Old Testament Bible. And sometimes we get too carried away with life, and we don't really see what God is trying to instill in us. All this time of attraction, seeking the best for one another, submitting to one another. Look at what is written here in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5. When a man has taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home 1 year and bring happiness to the wife whom he has taken. Can you imagine doing such a thing? To take a whole year off? How long would it take for you to save up enough money to pay for a whole year of expenses as you're thinking about getting married and doing such things? I talked yesterday or the day before about how we have these expenses that come along, and recently adolescents, we were talking about the bridegroom coming and the virgins that were waiting. You recall Jesus talking about that. And they didn't know when the bridegroom was coming back. The reason why is because the bridegroom would have to prepare, to have a place to live and prepare and put back all these things that were needed. And in this passage we see that for a whole year he's not supposed to be charged with business. His business is to make sure that that relationship gets off to a wonderful, wonderful start. So imagine what happened now. The bridegroom, he doesn't know when these things are going to be met, but the moment he meets those criteria, he is ready then to gather up his part of the party to say, let's go get the rest and let's get this wedding underway. Well, that's a part of the infatuation. That's a part of the attraction. That's a part of the part where we also ignore the faults of one another. Sometimes when we enter into this stage of the happy honeymoon, we're going to find some things that we simply just ignore in one another. And that's wonderful too, isn't it? It's wonderful because this is my mate, this is my spouse, this is my life, these are the things that we've dreamed about, and now we go underway. It doesn't last though, does it? That happy honeymoon isn't always that perfect time. I had mentioned about the couple that came off the honeymoon cruise. They went on a honeymoon cruise, and when they came back, they were getting ready to get up the next morning after the cruise, and they were both awake. Their backs were turned to one another, and they were both laying there, and the husband was thinking, why hasn't my wife got up yet to cook the breakfast? I should be smelling bacon and eggs by now. And the wife was laying there thinking, why hasn't my husband got up yet to start the coffee? And see what they did, they came from different roles in their families, where the one was more traditional, the mom got up and cooked the breakfast, but in the other role, the mom always worked as well, and so the dad was always one to get up and brew a cup of coffee and bring it and have it there for his wife first thing in the morning. Our expectations sometimes are different as we get started, but in that happy honeymoon period, we're willing and able to really ignore a lot of that and to not see the faults with one another. But then that takes us to a different stage of life, and I want us to go over to the book of Proverbs, and let's see just a couple of passages here in Proverbs, and we'll go to chapter 21 first, and then over to chapter 25. Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 9, here we have the stage about understanding and growing through our differences. Through our differences. Things don't always stay the same. You know, that perfect husband that you married that was just so handy and everything else, before long you figure that he has some eyesight problems because he can never see his socks that he left on the floor in order to pick them up and put them in the hamper. And he can never see that garbage can that's overflowing that needs to be taken out. And he's got a smelling problem too, because when the babies come, he never detects a dirty diaper until after he's already left the room and you call him and ask him if he knew about that dirty diaper. And so these things are there, but it's not always perfect on the other side of the coin either. In chapter 21 of Proverbs, in verse 9, the writer says, it's better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Now, I want to tell you something. There's a phrase about happy wife, happy life, and it also goes to say happy spouse, happy house. We need to keep both sides of the marriage happy, don't we? And so to do that doesn't mean that we need to condone anything that's wrong or to instill any bad behavior, but we certainly need to figure out a way to encourage better things. In this stage, many marriages simply fold up and they dissolve because people are not as committed as they should be to see themselves through this. This becomes a part of disillusionment. I thought this would be a perfect marriage. I thought my spouse would be perfect and never make mistakes and never do things. I didn't know that she could wear a green mask and come out at night, right before bedtime and have that thing all over her face. Or she says, I didn't know that he would clip his toenails in the living room or at the kitchen table. Whatever it is that's there. We all have faults. We all have flaws. And so there's this stage of disillusionment that we have. We also have this sense of resentment at times that comes on. That we get so familiar with one another that we may resent some things. We find that we are more defensive about things. And instead of overlooking the flaws and faults of our spouse, we may actually point them out and help them to realize that they have these things. We also often through this time, may even fall into a sense of depression about the choices that we've made. I like the adage that someone had years ago about when you leave the house and enter into your marriage, it's always good to leave your old home key with your parents and not take it with you. There was one wedding that I did years ago, and they symbolically turned their house key back into their parents. And that was their way of saying, we're not coming back into your house. And I encourage the parents to let the kids know as they're getting ready to get married, this is your life now. You remember what God said there in Genesis and what Jesus also relayed there in Matthew, that you are to leave your father and mother and cleave unto your wife, and there you'll be one flesh. You started a new life. And although we love you, we don't want you coming back. We want you to stay there and work things out. We'll help you. But we want you to know that you need to stay there and work these things through. There's another passage there in Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 24. And it's similar to this as well. It is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. They're just about exactly the same thing. Some have said at this stage, well, the party's over. We didn't agree just to go to the party. In John chapter 2, when Jesus was turning the water to wine, John says that this was the first of the signs that Jesus performed. And because of that and other things, we find that people learned about Jesus and they came to him and they had faith in him. The nobleman came to him later then in John chapter 4, wishing for Jesus to go back with him and to heal his son. He had never healed anybody, according to John at that point. He had only had the one miracle, but he had that had gone out so that people knew that this was a man that could do great things. But at that wedding feast was going on for a long time. The weddings might last 2 weeks at a time. And so as you're getting into this, we're not just there for the party, we're there for the long term. We might find a sense of routine or even a dullness that comes into this time period with us. We might find that we become more argumentative over time. That black and white TV that we had, that had the no remote, that was a source of closeness for us as we could be together for that. And for many years, my wife and I, we liked the same shows, whether we really liked them or not, because we loved each other, and there was a sense of give and take. And so she was able to, she watched a lot of shows she didn't like, but she did because she liked me. And I watched a lot of shows too that I didn't like, but I watched them because I liked her. But sometimes you get a little tension that rises up. Sometimes the criticisms hurt a little bit more than they should because we're close. It's during these times that we can grow so much more and that we can look towards that last stage, that third stage, and that would be more the stage of a mature love. I know that I don't have a lot of different passages in this lesson as I did in the previous lessons of this, but turn with me over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we often refer to this as the love chapter. And although it's not particularly suited for every situation, we often will find this read at weddings from time to time. If we can get through the happy honeymoon stage, if we can really get through all of those good things and then work through that understanding and growing through difficulty stage, there comes a point where we have grown together. We have learned to accept the flaws of one another. We have learned to say, I'm sorry, very sincerely, and to have forgiveness for the things that we've done. And we have seen that if you work through those difficult times when things just really weren't perfect, but then they do line up, we can find this wonderful stage of mature love. I know that many of you know of people such as Jim Bill McIntyre, who passed several years ago. And you may also know the story that his wife was afflicted with a disease and she wasn't able to take care of herself. And Jim Bill, for many years, would take her with him on meetings, and he would arrange for someone there at that meeting to sit with his wife, but he would take care of her. He would take her, dress her, he would put his makeup on her and do all these things, and she had no idea where she was or what was going on. And seeing situations like that in a public setting really causes everyone to stop and think, I wonder if my spouse would take care of me like that. I wonder if I would be willing to take care of my spouse like that. I mentioned on Sunday, I believe it was, that when my wife and I were married 35 and a half years ago, my father had 7 typed pages of the wedding ceremony. And it seemed like so long to wait. And all I could do was I was just listening for 2 things. When do I say I do, and when do I kiss my bride? That was all I heard the whole time. I've since read through the wedding script, and it was a nice wedding. But that night I didn't hear any of it except, do you and will you kiss the bride? But as we go through, we begin to realize, don't we? We don't really know what's coming next. Listen to these verses now from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and let's begin at about verse 4. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, and does not seek its own, is not provoked. Love thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And love never fails. Whenever I take on a couple that want to get married, we go through some counseling. One of the first questions I ask them right off the bat is, why do you want to get married? Now, I'm not trying to encourage them to live together. I'm trying to just really find out, why do you want to get married? And of course they say, because we love each other. And I'm like, all right, well, let's get that answer out of the way. Tell me deeper, how do you love each other? And then we start to talk about some of the scenarios that might happen to them in life. What's going to happen to you if you are able to be married for a while and then your husband loses his job and he's not able to work, and now you have to work and support the family and your husband's not going to be able to work anymore? Are you willing to do that? What happens if you're going to be in an economically stressful situation? You're going to enter into this marriage, and what happens if you're going to be below the poverty line? Will you still be happy with this husband? Oh, this is a beautiful woman that you're getting ready to marry. Now, what happens if something disfigures her beauty? Will you still marry her? And some of those tough questions, believe it or not, people have never contemplated. Oh, they know that the preacher's going to say, well, we're going to join this man and woman in holy matrimony today before God and these witnesses. And then we're going to go through these vows. And we're going to say this is for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. But we don't really know what that is at those early stages. But by the time we work through those first two stages and get ready for our mature love, we know what that mature love really is. In my situation, it happened very early in our marriage. I love my wife, Carla. She is a joy. And she is today not anything what we thought she would be. And our marriage today is not anything what we planned it to be in 1983 when we were planning our marriage. And the reason is just simply this. About a year and a half into our marriage, my wife developed a non-malignant meningioma tumor. It grew very rapidly. It was back behind this bone right up over her right eye. It grew to about the size of a medium lemon. And it was between the bone and her brain, and pushed back on her brain, created all kinds of problems. And she struggled with things. We went to different doctors. They thought it was all kind of things, until she finally reached the point where we had to take her in. And one of the doctors, when he looked into her eyes, he went over and made a phone call to a friend of his, and he says, all right, we're going to take you now to the hospital. And they discovered that tumor. She had a lot of complications after that surgery, unfortunately, and instead of taking that non-malignant tumor out and her being able to return to work very quickly, she developed a severe infection, and she almost died. As a matter of fact, the doctors from the CDC were there. You've all been at the hospitals. You've seen these IV stands that are all around. She had 2 of those stands, each one with 3 or 4 bags dripping those medicines down into her. We've been married a year and a half. We're 8 hours away from any of our relatives, and yet they're all there. Oh, everybody's there. She'd been a high school teacher at Great Atlanta Christian School. And so many of the students and the faculty members were there. The churches in the area were praying for her. I really thought she was going to die. She didn't. It was about 16 weeks before I got her home. That was for the hospital and then rehab afterwards. She had a surgery, and she had a lot of problems and some difficulties. She went through a spell where she had she was in a coma and paralyzed on one side. And when she came out, because of all the medicines, she was about 80 to 90 pounds heavier than when she went in, and had to learn to walk again and do things. It was 2 full years before we got her to where she could be gainfully employed at any level. And there was a time at which we went to some occupational therapy. And I mentioned this, I believe, as well. And one of the therapists came to me one night. We've been there several sessions. And she came and she said, now, Mike, she said, your wife is making some good progress, but you don't have very much invested in this marriage. And she's going to have a hard way to go. And if you wanted to, she would probably do better if you just divorced her and let her go back with her parents. And you go ahead and get another life and another wife. Well, that was the last time we went to that counselor. When we stand up before others and when we say, I do, we're making a vow, a commitment. The Bible says that it is better for us not to vow than to make a vow and not keep it. And I believe that God always has the right answers. Now, in 1985, when Carl went through that surgery, I could not tell you what 1986 would look like. I could not tell you if my wife would be who she is today, which is a wonderful, fully engaged person, or if it would be, as they said, 70% chance of it was going to be, that she would be more or less a vegetable and live to the age of 80 or 90, not being able to feed herself or take care of herself. You think about that as someone who's going into a marriage just less than 2 years in, and think about your spouse being in a nursing home, wanting you to come every day and to take care of her in those ways. Those are the commitments that in the early stages many people can't take, and they can't rationalize how to handle those. Carl and I were both very fortunate, though. We had wonderful, loving Christian parents and grandparents, and they loved us to the extent that we learned early on that we trust God every day. You trust God every day. And so when you see those things that are challenges, you trust that God can help you get from sun up to sundown. You don't worry about the next day. You worry about this day. Every day has its own problems. Don't worry about the future. We also found out that the more that we loved each other, the more that we trusted God, the more that we knew that even though the future would never be the path that we had already charted, we knew that with God, it didn't matter what path we were on, God was going to take care of us. My wife returned to the workforce, and she returned to a very fruitful life, and I love her so much. And there are still days that we point out one another's flaws, and there are still days that we disappoint each other, but there are never any days that we wish we weren't together. because we love each other. Not like the happy honeymooners. We love each other because we've reached that stage of mature love where we know what it really is. And let me just read again this passage that Paul has in 1 Corinthians 13. Think on these things. Encourage the younger people that are looking into marriage or going through the first stages of their marriage to come back and frequently look at what love does. Love suffers long. That means it's patient. It's patient. My wife has a great difficulty with working with electronics. I love technology. My wife has difficulty with this. In her family, I'll say this, and you're recording this, Tim, so I'm sorry, it's going to be on tape. The Willoughby side of her family has this special gift of being able to touch a TV remote and deprogram it to where none of the buttons work at all. Her dad would come and visit with us sometimes, and he would be in there finding the ball game, and 5 minutes later, there's no buttons at all that work on that. And so technology hasn't always been the strong suit. My patience is tried often when those things are happening. As a matter of fact, on the way up here, I had a couple of files that I needed from my computer, and I called back while on the Bluetooth on the phone. And I said, Carla, I need you to go back to my office, and I need you to do something on my computer. She said, are you sure? And I said, yes, ma'am. And so she was able to follow my directions and to put things over into the cloud so I could have them on my phone. And I think she was happier than I was that it worked successfully. Hey, listen, patience is something we have to develop. Love suffers long. Love is kind. We're never to be unkind to one another, especially in our families. Love does not envy. We're not jealous of one another. Love does not parade itself and is not arrogant or puffed up. Love does not behave rudely. Love also does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. And love will bear all things. That means love really will be the part of the solution that gets you through. Oh, we're going to live on love. Well, you need a little cash and beans along the way too. But love is really the key thing that helps you get through. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And love never fails. When Peter denied Jesus, he did so 3 times. And Luke's account of that tells us that on the 3rd time when he was denying Jesus, that Jesus looked at him. And I can't imagine what that would be like to know that just a few hours before in the upper room, Peter says, along with the other disciples, we'll even die before we deny you. And Jesus says, no, as a matter of fact, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And I can't imagine what must have been on Peter's mind as he's denying vehemently that he knows Jesus at all, and that 3rd time to look up and there's Jesus looking right at you. It must have been devastating for Peter to know, I failed him. Here I was willing to give my life for him, and here I'm not willing to stand up for him in this setting. But John tells us that later on, in John chapter 21, before Jesus ascends, Jesus is there with the apostles. And he comes back and he's sitting there with John. 3 different times, with Peter. 3 different times he says, do you love me? Lord, you know that I love you. Do you love me? Lord, you know that I love you. Do you love me? Lord, you know that I love you. And I think that's such a wonderful symmetry that 3 times he denied and 3 times he was asked and was able to say, I love you. Love never fails. Oh, we're going to make mistakes in our lives. But when we have the stage of mature love, guess what happens? We can really love. There are sometimes that spouses will say to one another, I'll love you if. I'll love you if you take that trash out. Well, what you need to say is, I'd really appreciate it if you would do that, but your love should never be contingent on an if. When you made that commitment to that person, you said that you would love them till death do you part. Love is part of that solution. Even if the other side is not willing to love, your love makes a difference. Some people say, I will love you because. I will love you because you provide me with all the things that I want. It's good to have a good provider, but that's not the reason why you love them. Other times, people will say, I will love you when. I will love you when you can work through your addiction to drugs or alcohol or whatever. But that's not the answer either. Really what it comes down to is, I'll love you regardless. I'll love you regardless. Friends, when we make this commitment, we can open up to one another. We can also find out that we can give up many of our selfish traits. And finally, we can grow up with one another into what God wants us to be. I tell you, as a testimony to you tonight, like I said, 36 years ago, as we were preparing for our marriage, I would have never dreamed that I would be a preacher, that we've been through all that we've been through, that we would have adopted twin boys and been through all the adventures in our life. But going back over it, with a few exceptions of the silly things that I've made as decisions that I'd like to take back, I wouldn't change any of it. It's shown me what true love really is. And it's shown me also how to trust God in everything that you do. Friends, let's make sure that we build on that firm foundation. Remember, that house that's built needs to be built on that firm foundation of righteousness, on God's laws. And then you've made a commitment. So through that happy honeymoon and through that stage of working through the differences and on into the stages of mature love, I want to encourage you to make sure that you honor those commitments and those vows. Make sure that you give the effort whether your spouse does or not. Make sure that you're always doing things, as I mentioned on Sunday, and also last night, those three things. First and foremost, you've got to make sure that you're right with God. The rest doesn't work if you're not right with God. Secondly, make sure that you and your family are right with God. If you can't control your house, you certainly can't affect the lives of others in the church. And finally, number three, make sure that you and your congregation are right with God. It all starts with us, though, with us individually. And I want to encourage you tonight, as Bob comes to lead us in the song of encouragement, if you personally are not right with God in any way, don't leave here tonight until you have an opportunity to sit with someone. Let us pray with you. Let us help you through that. I know that you can pray to God and say, I'm ready to give up this and be right with you. But let us be a part of it. Let us support you and encourage you. And if you've not yet become a Christian, I want you to think very deeply on this tonight. Jesus Christ died so that our sins could be taken away. You're still in your sins if you're out of Christ. And that watery grave awaits you tonight. We've got a lot of things that we've covered tonight, but the most important thing is for you to be right with God. If we can help you in any way, we want you to come forward now while we stand and while we sing.